They walked in like they owned the war. Elite, untouchable, dripping arrogance and their buddy's blood. They thought the tired nurse in faded scrubs was a civilian who couldn't stomach the red. Then they saw her ink. They laughed, until the base commander rolled up his own damn sleeve. The smell of a trauma bay is a distinct heavy thing. It doesn't smell like bleach and clean linen, no matter what they show on television. It smells like hot copper. It smells like sweat, dirt, and the voided bowels of young men who suddenly realize they aren't immortal. Sarah knew the smell intimately. At 46, she had spent more than half her life breathing it in. She stood at the stainless steel sink, scrubbing her hands with iodine, watching the desert sun beat against the reinforced glass of the field hospital's double doors. The base was a dust-choked slab of concrete somewhere in the Syrian desert, officially classified as a logistics hub, unofficially serving as a patch-and-go station for the alphabet soup of special operations teams working the border. The radio on the wall crackled. Incoming, urgent surgical, 5 minutes out, gunshot wound, chest and extremity. Sarah didn't sigh. She didn't tense. She just reached for the sterile towels. Short, punchy breaths, heart rate steady. "Let's go, people!" she called out, her voice entirely devoid of panic. "Oh, negative blood from the cooler. 2 units, get the crash cart off the wall. Dr. Evans, you're on the airway." 4 minutes later, the double doors didn't just open. They were kicked off their magnetic latches. A tidal wave of noise, dust, and tactical gear flooded the sterile white room. 4 men, broad-shouldered, draped in ceramic plates, night vision mounts, and radios. They moved with the frantic predatory energy of operators still hopped up on adrenaline and contact. Between them, they carried a litter. "We need a doctor! Right now!" The man at the front was screaming, captain's bars on his plate carrier, young, maybe 30, eyes wide, pupils dilated. Sarah stepped in front of him. "I'm the charge nurse. Put him on bed 1. Now. He's bleeding out. He took a 7.62 under the armpit. It bypassed the plate. Bed 1. Drop the litter, Captain." Sarah's voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a dense, unmovable gravity. It was the voice of a woman who had seen worse men die on better days. They hoisted the wounded man onto the trauma bed. He was pale, ashy. His lips were taking on a bluish tint, and the tactical gauze stuffed into his right axillary region was already saturated, dripping heavy, dark drops onto the linoleum. "Get out of the way!" the captain snarled, trying to push past Sarah to keep pressure on the wound. "You're in my workspace," Sarah said, throwing a hip into the captain's thigh to physically displace him. She didn't look at him. Her hands were already moving. She grabbed a pair of trauma shears and ripped through the $200 combat shirt like it was wet tissue paper. "Hey, watch it!" one of the other operators barked. "Shut up," Sarah said. Not angry, just busy. "Evans, I need a chest tube set up, right side. He's got diminished breath sounds, tension pneumothorax building." She reached into the gaping wound under the operator's arm. The blood was warm and slick. She found the severed artery by feel, pinching it off with 2 fingers. The patient groaned, thrashing blindly. "Hold him down," Sarah ordered. The captain and his men scrambled to pin their buddy's legs and remain in good arm. They were strong, but clumsy in the clinical space. Sarah operated with surgical precision. While her right hand clamped the bleeder inside the muscle cavity, her left hand grabbed a clamp from the tray Evans pushed toward her. "Clamp, good. Now get me the combat gauze, the real stuff." For 10 minutes, the room was a blur of controlled violence. Suction machines gurgled, monitors shrieked. Sarah's hands were stained crimson up to the elbows. She barked orders, corrected the young resident, and stabilized the pressure, completely ignoring the 4 heavily armed alpha males hovering over her shoulders. It was only when the patient's heart rate settled from a frantic 150 down to a steady 95, and the bleeding was definitively controlled, that the tension in the room finally snapped. Sarah stepped back, stripping off her blood-soaked gloves. Underneath, her scrubs were ruined. The left sleeve of her tunic had ridden up past her elbow during the chaos, exposing the pale skin of her inner forearm. She walked over to the sink to wash the stray splatter from her wrists. The captain, finally catching his breath, leaned against the wall. He wiped sweat from his forehead, leaving a streak of his friend's blood across his own face. He looked at Sarah. He didn't say thank you. He was still running on the arrogant high of surviving a gunfight. His eyes tracked down to her exposed forearm. "Rough day at the office, Florence Nightingale," the captain sneered, his voice laced with the condescension of a man who thought combat was an exclusive club. He gestured with his chin toward her arm. "What the hell is that? Lose a bet in nursing school?" Sarah paused. She looked down at her arm. Just below the crook of her elbow, etched into the skin, was a tattoo. It was objectively ugly. The lines were blown out and faded to a sickly blue-green. It was a crude, jagged circle with 3 intersecting lines running through it, almost like a shattered compass rose. It didn't look like a professional parlor job. It looked like it had been carved with a guitar string and fountain pen ink. One of the other operators, a massive guy with a full sleeve of immaculate high-dollar tribal and skull tattoos, snorted. "Looks like prison ink, or a bad night in Tijuana." Sarah didn't pull her sleeve down. She didn't flush with embarrassment. She dried her hands on a paper towel, tossed it in the bin, and looked at the captain. "Your man is stable. They're taking him to the OR to repair the vessel. You can wait in the mess hall." "We're not going anywhere," the captain said, crossing his arms. "We're Delta. We stay with our guys." "You're in my trauma ward," Sarah replied flatly, "and you're tracking mud and biohazards on my floor. Mess hall, now." The captain scoffed, shaking his head. He looked at his men, sharing a smirking glance. "Civilian contractors. That's what the look said. They just don't get it." "All right, nurse," the captain said, dripping with mock compliance. "We'll go get some coffee. Try not to scrub that Sharpie off your arm. It really makes you look tough." Sarah watched them swagger out of the double doors. She didn't feel anger, just a profound, heavy exhaustion. Young men with guns. They were all the same. They thought the world began the day they finished selection, and that blood only mattered if it was spilled under their specific flag. She finally reached down and pulled her sleeve over the faded blue ink. The surgical wing hummed with the steady mechanical rhythm of keeping a man alive. It was 300 hours. The desert cold had seeped through the concrete walls, making the air in the hospital feel brittle. Sarah sat at the nurse's station, the glow of the monitors casting long, harsh shadows across her face. She held a styrofoam cup of black coffee. It tasted like battery acid and burnt aluminum. Perfect. Down the hall, the 4 Delta operators had established a makeshift camp in the waiting area. They had stripped off their heavy plates but kept their sidearms. They sprawled across the plastic chairs, boots up on tables, speaking in low, clipped tones. Sarah watched them over the rim of her cup. They were good at what they did. She knew that. You didn't get the gear they had, or the attitude, without passing through hell. But they wore their trauma like a badge of honor, loud and proud. Their tattoos told perfect stories. A Spartan helmet for a tough deployment. A dagger for a confirmed kill. Dates, coordinates. Polished and neatly shaded by an artist in Fayetteville or San Diego. Trophies. Sarah's eyes drifted down to her left forearm, covered by the cotton sleeve. Her tattoo wasn't a trophy, it was a receipt. 20 years ago. A jungle so thick the canopy blocked out the sun. No extraction. Radio's dead. 3 weeks of moving at night, living on rainwater, and the absolute terrified refusal to die. She hadn't been a nurse then. She hadn't been Florence Nightingale. She had been a 22-year-old kid attached to a unit that officially didn't exist, doing things that would never make it into a debriefing file. The ink had been ground into her skin in a safe house in Bogotá, done by a man missing 2 fingers, using a sewing needle wrapped in thread. It was the mark of the 6 of them who made it out. A broken compass. Meaning. No direction home. She took another sip of the terrible coffee. Footsteps approached. The captain, Miller, according to the Velcro tape on his uniform, ambled up to the nurse's station. He looked tired now. The adrenaline crash had hit him, leaving his face hollow and drawn. But the arrogance was still there, clinging to him like a protective shell. "How is he?" Miller asked. He didn't ask it like a question. He asked it like a demand. "Dr. Evans closed the artery. No major organ damage. He's in recovery. He'll be medevac to Landstuhl in the morning, Sarah said, keeping her eyes on the charting screen. Good. Miller leaned heavily on the high counter of the station. He drummed his fingers on the laminate. He was bored. The silence of the hospital was getting to him. Combat guys hated the quiet. It forced them to think. He looked at Sarah again. Really looked at her. Saw the greying hair at her temples. The deep lines around her mouth. You've been out here a while, he noted. Long enough. Must be weird, Miller said, a slight smirk playing on his lips. Fixing guys like us. Watching the real war from the sidelines. You patch 'em up, send 'em back out. Never knowing what it's actually like out there in the suck. Sarah stopped typing. She didn't look up immediately. She let the silence stretch out, thick and heavy, until Miller shifted uncomfortably on his feet. You think this is the sidelines, Captain? She asked softly. I mean, no offense. You do good work. Miller backpedaled slightly, though his tone was still patronizing. But yeah, you're inside the wire. You don't know what it takes to kick down a door, to be in a Tier 1 unit. He gestured to his own arm, tapping a beautifully rendered American flag, interlocked with a spear. You don't get these by handing out band-aids. He chuckled, remembering the scene in the trauma bay. Seriously though, what is that thing on your arm? Looks like my 5-year-old drew it. You get drunk on R&R in Subic Bay. Sarah finally looked up. Her eyes were flat, dead pools of brown. There was no anger in them, just an ancient, terrifying patience. I got it in a place you couldn't find on a map, Captain, Sarah said. Her voice was quiet, steady, and cut through the ambient noise of the hospital like a scalpel. And I got it doing a job that makes your little door-kicking routine look like a Boy Scout jamboree. Miller blinked. For a second, his smug expression slipped. Then he let out a short, barking laugh. Right, okay, killer. Whatever you say. He held up his hands in mock surrender. Didn't mean to disrespect the lethal nightingale. Keep telling yourself that. He turned and walked back to his men. Sarah watched him go. One of the other operators asked him something, and Miller replied, laughing. The word nurse drifted down the hallway, followed by more chuckles. Sarah didn't react. She went back to her keyboard. She had learned a long time ago that you don't argue with tourists, and in the grand, bloody history of warfare, Captain Miller was just passing through. The sun broke over the desert horizon, painting the concrete base in harsh, unforgiving shades of orange and grey. At 700, the base alarms didn't sound, but the atmosphere shifted instantaneously. It was a ripple effect, felt by every soldier, contractor, and medic on the compound. Posture straightened. Boots were hurriedly wiped. Cigarettes were stamped out. Lock it down, a sergeant major barked from the corridor outside the ward. General on deck. Sarah was finishing her shift handover. She was exhausted, her back aching in a dull, familiar way. She gathered her clipboard and her thermos, preparing to head to her quarters for a solid 4 hours of dead sleep before doing it all over again. Down the hall, the Delta team was on their feet. Even they weren't immune to the gravity of 4 stars. They stood in a loose but respectful formation near the doors of the recovery room, waiting. General Thomas Hammond was a ghost story made flesh. He wasn't one of the polished, Pentagon-dwelling politicians who wore stars and commanded from a desk. Hammond was old school. Rumour had it he had spent the 90s doing things the government still refused to declassify. He walked with a slight limp, a souvenir from a downed helo in a place that officially had no American presence. He was tall, grey-haired, with a face carved from weathered stone and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He walked through the double doors of the surgical wing, followed by a tight entourage of aides and base commanders. The air in the room seemed to thin out. Room! Attention! Miller called out, snapping into a rigid salute. His men followed suit perfectly. Hammond stopped. He looked at the Delta team. He didn't return the salute immediately. He let them hold it. He looked at their dusty gear, their blood-stained boots, and finally at Miller. At ease, Hammond rumbled. His voice was like grinding rocks. Miller dropped his arm, puffing his chest out slightly. Sir, Captain Miller, Task Force, I know who you are, Captain, Hammond interrupted, not unkindly, but with utter disinterest. I read the AAR on my way in. Sloppy insertion. You pushed too fast, outran your overwatch, and got your man shot. You're lucky he's breathing. Miller's face flushed violently, the arrogance drained out of him, replaced by a sudden, sickening embarrassment in front of his team. Sir, the enemy had— Save it for the debrief, Hammond said, moving past him without a second glance. He walked directly to the window of the recovery room, looking in at the wounded operator. He nodded once, satisfied with the machinery keeping the man alive. Hammond turned back to the corridor. His entourage shifted, ready to escort him to the mess hall or the command center. But Hammond stopped. He was looking down the hall, past the humbled Delta team, toward the nurses' station. Sarah was standing there, holding her clipboard. She hadn't saluted. Civilians didn't salute. She just watched the spectacle with tired, indifferent eyes. She was waiting for the brass to clear the choke point so she could go to bed. Hammond's eyes narrowed. He took a step forward, leaving his aides behind. Miller and his men watched in confusion as the 4-star general, a man who had just dressed down an elite team leader without raising his voice, walked slowly toward the tired, middle-aged nurse. Hammond stopped 3 feet from Sarah. The entire hospital wing was dead silent. The only sound was the rhythmic beeping of the cardiac monitors in the background. Sarah looked at the general. The general looked at Sarah. "You're out of uniform, soldier," Hammond said. His voice wasn't an order. It was thick with something none of the men in the room had ever heard from him before. Emotion. Sarah offered a small, exhausted smile. "I'm a civilian now, Tom. Haven't worn a uniform in 15 years. Miller's jaw practically hit the linoleum. Tom? Did she just call the theatre commander by his first name? Hammond let out a breath that sounded suspiciously like a laugh. He reached out slowly and placed a large scarred hand on Sarah's shoulder. "I see you're still cleaning up after kids who don't know how to check their corners." "Somebody has to," Sarah replied. Hammond's eyes dropped down. He saw the edge of the blue-green ink peeking out from the hem of her scrub sleeve. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He reached down to his own left arm. He unbuttoned the cuff of his pristine combat uniform. Slowly, deliberately, in front of his aides, the base commander, and the wide-eyed Delta operators, General Hammond rolled his sleeve up past his elbow. There, on the thick, corded muscle of his forearm, was a tattoo. It wasn't a soaring eagle. It wasn't an American flag. It was faded. It was ugly. It was blown out and etched in sickening blue-green ink. It was a jagged, broken compass rose, crossed by 3 uneven lines, exactly like Sarah's. The quiet in the corridor took on a sudden physical density. It was the kind of absolute, ringing silence that follows a detonation. Dust motes drifted lazily through the beams of harsh fluorescent light. The rhythmic beep hiss of the ventilator in the adjacent room suddenly sounded like a pile driver. Captain Miller stared at the general's arm. Then he stared at the nurse's arm. He did the mental math, and the equation terrifyingly clicked into place. General Thomas Hammond was a legend in the Joint Special Operations Command. His file was entirely redacted prior to 2004. The stories about him were the kind passed around team rooms like contraband, whispers of deep cover operations in South America, black site interrogations, and units that existed only on off-the-books budgets. Men like Miller modelled their entire careers on the mythology of men like Hammond. And Hammond was standing there, ignoring a hallway full of Tier 1 operators, staring at a tired middle-aged nurse with identical crude cartel ink scarred into his forearm. "Columbia," Hammond said. His voice was a low, gravelly scrape that barely carried past Sarah. "98," Sarah replied, her tone perfectly matching his. Flat, matter of fact. "Feels like a different century, Tom." It was a different world. Hammond ran a thumb over the blown-out edges of his own ink. The stars on his collar caught the light, but in that specific moment, he didn't look like a theatre commander. He looked old. He looked like a man who had left pieces of his soul in a wet, rotting jungle and never quite figured out how to get them back. "I tried tracking down the artist a few years back. The guy with the missing fingers in Bogota. Wanted to see if he was still butchering American skin." "You find him?" Died in a cartel shootout in 2001, Hammond said. He finally looked up from his arm, meeting Sarah's eyes. Davis. Liver cancer. 2 years ago, Sarah answered quietly. She shifted her clipboard against her hip. Mitchell drank himself to death in 18, wrapped his truck around a bridge abutment outside Fayetteville. Hammond's jaw tightened. A microscopic twitch in his cheek was the only betrayal of grief. He nodded slowly. So it's just us. Just us, Tom. The last of the broken compasses. Miller felt a cold, prickling sweat break out across the back of his neck. He was suddenly hyper-aware of his own posture, of the expensive gear hanging off his vest, of the immaculate professional sleeve of tattoos on his left arm. An hour ago, he had felt like an apex predator walking among sheep. Now, standing 3 feet away from this exchange, he felt like a child wearing his father's combat boots. He had mocked her. He had asked her if she lost a bet in nursing school. Just us. The words hung in the air. 6 people went into whatever nightmare that ink represented. 2 were left alive. Hammond finally broke his gaze away from Sarah and turned his head slowly. He didn't move his body, just his neck, locking his cold, grey eyes onto Captain Miller. The general didn't look angry. Anger would have been easier to handle. He looked profoundly, utterly disappointed. Captain Miller, Hammond said. Miller snapped to attention again, his spine rigid, his voice tight. Sir, do you know who this woman is? Miller swallowed hard. His throat felt like it was coated in sand. No, sir, I do not. This is former Chief Warrant Officer Sarah Jenkins, Hammond stated, his voice ringing slightly louder now, ensuring every man in the Delta unit heard it. Intelligence support activity, though we didn't call it the activity back then. We didn't call it anything. We just went where the Pentagon didn't have the stomach to send conventional forces. One of Miller's men, the massive guy who had made the Tijuana joke, visibly swallowed, his eyes darting to the floor. The activity, the Phantom Army, the unit that paved the way for Delta and SEAL Team 6, 20 years ago, Hammond continued, his voice dropping back to a lethal calm. My team was compromised 20 miles outside of Medellin. Our extraction bird was shot down. Our comms were jammed. The cartel put a $500,000 bounty on our heads. We spent 3 weeks moving through the canopy. No sleep. Drinking mud. We were ambushed on day 12. Our medic took a round to the throat. Hammond gestured slowly to Sarah. Jenkins wasn't a medic. She was signals intelligence, a spook. But she picked up the med kit, packed the wound with dirt and superglue because we had nothing else, and she kept him breathing for 5 days while returning fire. She carried his rifle and his pack. She got him to the exfil point. We got the ink the night we made it over the border, knowing nobody back home would ever acknowledge we were there. Hammond stepped closer to Miller. The proximity was suffocating. The general smelled of starched uniform cotton, stale coffee, and raw authority. Your man in that bed is alive right now because Sarah Jenkins has forgotten more about trauma under fire than you will ever learn in your entire, heavily subsidized career, Captain. Yes, sir, Miller croaked. He didn't defend himself. There was absolutely no defense to mount. The floor felt like it was tilting beneath him. The arrogance he had carried into the trauma bay had evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, sickening realization of his own hubris. Hammond held Miller's gaze for 3 agonizing seconds before turning back to Sarah. The hardness vanished from his face, replaced once again by that quiet, weary camaraderie. You sleep at all these days, Sarah? Hammond asked gently. When they let me, Sarah said. She offered a small, genuine smile. I prefer the night shift. It's quieter. Usually. Hammond chuckled. A dry, raspy sound. He reached down and meticulously buttoned his cuff back up, hiding the faded blue-green ink from the world once more. Keep them alive, Sarah. They don't know any better. I always do, Tom. Good to see you. You too, Chief. Hammond gave her a single crisp nod. Not a salute, but an acknowledgement of absolute equals, before turning on his heel. Let's move, he barked at his entourage. The group of aides and base commanders scrambled to follow his brisk, limping stride down the corridor. leaving the trauma wing in their wake. The silence rushed back in, thicker than before. Sarah stood there for a moment. She looked at the 4 heavily armed men. They weren't lounging anymore. They weren't whispering or smirking. They stood rigidly, staring at her with wide, complex expressions. She didn't gloat. She didn't demand an apology. She simply looked down at her clipboard, checked the ink levels on her pen, and sighed. "Your transport is scheduled for 900, Sarah said, her voice entirely devoid of malice or triumph. It was just the flat, professional tone of a charge nurse. "Have your gear staged by the south doors. Dr. Evans will be out with the post-op paperwork in 20 minutes. Don't crowd the corridor." Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked toward the staff locker room. The locker room smelled of cheap disinfectant and old sneakers. Sarah sat heavily on the wooden bench, closing her eyes for a long, quiet minute. Her back throbbed. The joints in her knees, ground down by decades of carrying weight, first rucksacks, then human bodies, ached with a dull, persistent fire. She reached down and pulled off her blood-splattered rubber clogs. She threw them into the biohazard bin in the corner. They were too far gone to bleach. She opened her narrow metal locker and pulled out her civilian boots. As she laced them up, her eyes drifted to the faded ink on her left arm. "Just us." Hammond's words echoed in her skull. It was a heavy thing, being the last custodian of a memory. The other 4 were gone. Taken by disease, by the bottle, by the ghosts that followed them back from the jungle. She and Tom were the only ones still breathing the air. People often asked her why she became a nurse after leaving the activity. They expected a story of redemption, some grand epiphany about the sanctity of life. The truth was much uglier and much simpler. She had spent her entire youth learning how to meticulously and efficiently take the human body apart. When she got out, the silence of the civilian world was deafening. The only place she felt at home was in the chaos. But she was done pulling triggers. Nursing was the only job that offered the same adrenaline, the same blood, the same high-stakes problem-solving, but in reverse. She didn't want to destroy anymore. She just wanted to patch the holes. Sarah stood up, shucked off her ruined scrub top, and pulled on a clean, faded grey t-shirt and a battered canvas jacket. She grabbed her keys, her thermos, and her sunglasses. It was time to go sleep in a cinder block room for 4 hours. She pushed out through the locker room doors and walked back through the main corridor. The hospital was fully awake now. Day shift nurses were bustling between rooms, carrying trays and charting tablets. The harsh, desert sunlight was streaming through the reinforced windows at the end of the hall. As she approached the double doors leading to the exterior compound, a figure stepped out from the alcove near the vending machines. It was Captain Miller. He was alone. His team was nowhere in sight. He had stripped off his plate carrier and tactical belt, wearing only his combat shirt and trousers. Without the armor, he looked smaller. He looked younger. He looked exactly like what he was. A 30-year-old kid who was very good at violence, but hadn't yet learned the cost of it. Sarah stopped. She didn't cross her arms. She just waited. Miller walked up to her. He didn't swagger. The aggressive, chest-out posture was completely gone. He stopped a respectful distance away, his hands clasped nervously in front of him. He looked at the floor, then up at her face. "Ma'am," Miller started. His voice was quiet, hesitant. "It's Sarah," she corrected him gently. "I work for a living." Miller swallowed. "Sarah, I waited to catch you before you left." He struggled to find the words. This wasn't a man accustomed to apologizing. He was trained to dominate, to overwhelm, to never show weakness. But the encounter with Hammond had shattered the fragile glass house of his ego. "You don't need to do this, Captain," Sarah said, recognizing the struggle in his eyes. "Yeah, I do," Miller insisted, stepping slightly closer. He looked her directly in the eyes. "I was out of line, completely out of line. I walked into your ward, I disrespected you, and I acted like an arrogant rookie. I judged you by the uniform you weren't wearing." Sarah looked at him. She saw the genuine shame in his posture. "You were running hot," Sarah said evenly. "Your boy was bleeding out. Adrenaline makes people stupid. I've seen it 1,000 times. That's not an excuse, Miller replied, shaking his head. I thought because we wear the fancy gear and do the high-profile raids that we own the monopoly on the suck. I thought you were just some civilian contractor who didn't understand what it took. He paused, glancing down at her left arm, which was now covered by the sleeve of her canvas jacket. I didn't know. You weren't supposed to know, Miller. That's the whole point of quiet professionals. Sarah shifted her thermos to her other hand. She looked past him, out the window, at the sprawling concrete base baking in the morning heat. You're a good operator, Captain. I saw the way you and your men moved in that trauma bay. You're fast, you're lethal, but you're carrying around a fundamental misunderstanding of this job. Miller frowned slightly, listening intently. What do you mean? You treat the trauma like a trophy, Sarah said, her voice dropping to a low, intimate register. You collect the deployments, the firefights, the scars. You get the tattoos to prove you were there. You wear it loud because you want everyone to know you survived. She reached out and lightly tapped the center of his chest, right over his heart. But the ink doesn't make you bulletproof, kid. And the real scars, the ones that actually matter, aren't the ones you brag about in the mess hall. They're the ones you spend the rest of your life trying to hide. The ones that wake you up at 3 a.m. Miller looked down at her hand against his chest, then back up to her face. The bravado was entirely stripped away. What does it mean? The compass. Sarah dropped her hand. She thought about the jungle. She thought about Davis and Mitchell. She thought about the smell of wet earth and copper. It means we were lost, Sarah said quietly. It means all the technology, all the training, all the backup in the world failed. The map was useless. The compass was broken. It means we realized that nobody was coming for us, and the only way out was through the dark. Miller stared at her, absorbing the absolute, terrifying gravity of the statement. He had been on bad missions. He had taken fire. But he had always had Overwatch. He had always had a radio that connected him to a multi-billion-dollar military apparatus ready to rain hellfire to pull him out. He suddenly realized he had never truly been completely, utterly alone. I'm sorry, Miller said. And this time, it carried the full weight of a man who finally understood. For my disrespect, and for your team. Sarah studied his face for a long moment. She saw the shift. He was a little older now than he had been an hour ago. A little wiser. She offered a single, curt nod. Keep your head on a swivel out there, Captain. Check your corners. And for God's sake, if you get shot, try not to bleed all over my clean floors. A faint, self-deprecating smile broke across Miller's face. Yes, ma'am. I'll do my best. He extended his right hand. It wasn't a casual gesture. It was formal, rigid with respect. Sarah looked at his hand. She shifted her thermos, reached out and grasped it. Her grip was calloused, shockingly strong, and deeply professional. They shook. One generation of ghosts to the next. Miller stepped back, giving her the right of way. Sarah pushed through the heavy double doors and walked out into the blinding Syrian sun. The heat hit her instantly, dry and suffocating. She put on her sunglasses, shielding her tired eyes from the glare. Behind her, inside the air-conditioned cool of the hospital, Captain Miller stood by the glass, watching her walk away. He watched her until she disappeared around the corner of the concrete barracks. A small, unassuming figure, swallowed by the massive machinery of the war zone. He looked down at his own arm, at the pristine, colourful tattoo of the flag and the spear. It was beautiful artwork. But suddenly, it just felt like ink. He turned around and walked slowly back down the corridor toward his men. He didn't strut. He didn't swagger. He walked softly, carrying the new, heavy understanding that the most dangerous people in the room are rarely the ones making the most noise. Sometimes, they are just the ones quietly cleaning up the blood. The loudest guy in the room is rarely the most dangerous. Sarah and the General proved that real respect isn't demanded by the gear you wear. It's earned in the darkest places on Earth, where nobody is coming to save you. True veterans carry their scars in silence. Did this story give you chills? If you want more grounded, intense stories about hidden heroes, smash that like button. share this with a friend, and subscribe for more.